Right. My clock has moved on to 3 minutes past the hour. Chris, may I ask you to put the first slide on? Welcome, everybody. You are listening to the webcast, to the webinar on ISAP 1A and ISAP 5. Those are the two standards that were adopted by the IAA Council in November last year in South Africa. So that's the subject. You can still log out now if this is not what you wanted to hear. If I can have the next slide, please. Yeah, welcome to all of you. We have 48 attendees now. Just a brief overview of the purpose of the webinar. I just mentioned that we're talking about ISAP 1A and ISAP 5. We're soliciting all of you to post your questions in the chat. You have a box available there that you can ask questions, and I hope that you will do even better than the group that we had on 9 hours ago. They asked a total of 5 questions, so here's hoping that you will answer, that you will ask at least that number. As to the presenters, we have Godfrey Perrott, the ASC Liaison and ASC Vice Chair, and he will be talking about ISAP 1A. Then we have Albia, also Vice Chair of the ASC and the ASC Liaison to the ISAP 5 Task Force. My name is Alf Godes. I'm the Chair of the ASC, and I will attempt to moderate this webinar today. Just as additional info, these slides will be posted on the website as of tomorrow. Either the slides or the full recording of the webinar. In any case, you will be able to see the slides on the website. If I can have the next slide, please. The usual disclaimer. We are 3 members of the ASC, but we are not representing the entire ASC in any legal shape or form, and neither are we representing the positions of the IAA, just so that that is clear. If we can move on to the next slide, please. The agenda point 1 is almost completed. I will give a brief overview of the background to the webinar, and then Godfrey Perrott will present the ISAP 1A story and Albia the ISAP 5 stories, and then we will go to questions and answers. We hope to give at least 20 minutes for that, and then we'll close. Next slide, please. Yeah, I just want to give a brief background to the tasks that the 2 task forces had to deal with. You can imagine that drawing up a standard poses its own problems, and each task force had to deal with their own set of problems. But here we had an additional issue, namely that the ISAP 5 task force and their commenters also had their views on what ISAP 1A should contain, because those 2 standards are interdependent. And the ISAP 1A task force had its own view as to what ISAP 5 should contain. So for one, the 2 standards were rightfully developed in parallel, for the main reason that they rely very heavily on the governance of models. So the coordination alone between these 2 projects was a big challenge, and I was looking for an image to depict how the task force the two task forces advanced the ISAP strategy. You know, we have a strategy for ISAPs. The Greeks would have called it the ISAP goddess. And on the next slide, this is my image, please, if we can have the next slide up, that we have the lady being brought forward through the water without her being ditched by the two dolphins. So not only did the task forces need to advance themselves, but they also had to make sure that the lady didn't fall off. And they did so in a in a very efficient way. Having said that, Godfrey, can I pass the cue on to you?
Yes, thanks very much, Al. I wanted to make a couple of comments on this slide. First of all, if you joined the web, you can leave now. This is the only entertaining slide in the webinar. Secondly, I pointed out to Alf that he had made a possible mistake. You'll notice that the 1A dolphin is gagged, so I offered to make my presentation similar to the Emperor's Clothes and just be silent. I couldn't get off that easily. He rejected my suggestion. Next slide, please, Chris. So I'm going to talk about ISAP 1A, which we developed in a fairly short time frame. The SOI was approved by Council in October 2015 in Vancouver. We published the exposure draft immediately afterwards. Obviously, we had been working on it before the final approval, and we got many good comments. We published the final review draft in August, and Council adopted it in November in Cape Town. Next slide, please. We had a small but very proficient task force, Gabor Hanak from Hungary, who is an ASC member, myself as both chair and ASC liaison, and as Alf said, I am a vice chair of the ASC. Francis Rucht from the Netherlands, who is a former ASC member, and Jesus Zuniga from Mexico, also a former ASC member. So all four of us had experience in developing standards within the IAA ASC structure, which meant we got up and running very quickly. That helped in the development speed. Next slide, please. There were several issues we had to address, however, and I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on them. First of all, model governance, or let me back up. We have deliberately titled the ISAP Governance of Models, although we frequently use the term model governance as shorthand. The reason it's not the ISAP title is we found people were interpreting model governance to mean models of appropriate corporate governance as opposed to governance of models. So we adopted the formal title, Governance of Models. It has emerged as a hot topic over the last 5 years since ISAP 1 was adopted in Nassau in 2012, which is why we started addressing it in the Zurich meeting in 2014. 2015. It has an impact on ISAPs 4, 5, 6, and 7. And just to refresh your memory on what they are, ISAP 4 is insurance contracts under IFRS 17. ISAP 5 is insurer enterprise risk models. ISAP 6 is enterprise risk management programs, and IAIS core principles, insurance core principles, and ISAP 7 is current estimates and other matters in relation to the IAIS capital standards. So as you can tell, all four of those ISAPs involve modeling, and not only ISAP 5 had opinions on what should be covered on model governance, but we had some input from the task forces for ISAP 4, 6, and 7, which are still in development. We felt we identified three ways we could address the topic of model governance. We could update and expand ISAP 1 to include it directly. We could write a separate ISAP, or we could insert identical guidance into each of the other four ISAPs. We originally wanted to update ISAP 1, as that is clearly the logical location, but we were dissuaded because several standard setters told us in Zurich that they were in the process of digesting ISAP 1 and either adopting it or adjusting their standards to be substantially consistent. And if we opened up ISAP 1, that effort would stop for the duration that we were developing and getting approval of a revised ISAP 1. We thought that was definitely not desirable. We could write a separate ISAP. We didn't like that, and we agonized over how to number it, but in the end, that was the direction we took. The problem with inserting identical guidance into the other four ISAPs and possibly other ISAPs not yet conceived is it would be very repetitious, and there's a risk that the language would get out of sync at some point, and that would be very troublesome. So we decided on a separate ISAP, and we called it ISAP 1A. Next slide, please. I thought it worth stopping for a minute and commenting on why model governance had become such a hot topic so fast. I identified four possible reasons. These are strictly my personal opinion. You certainly are welcome to disagree with them or to have other reasons that I hadn't thought of. Certainly the elephant in the room, I think, is the 2008 financial crisis. It's not clear to what extent inadequate model governance played into that, but I think virtually everyone believes that it at least exacerbated the crisis. It probably didn't cause it. And we didn't want to repeat the exercise. The large financial institutions, banks and insurance companies, were using internal models for management purposes, and they very much wanted to use them for regulatory purposes, but in the light of the financial crisis, regulators viewed internal models very suspiciously and suspected some companies of gaming the system. And I believe the large companies embraced model governance as a way to prove to regulators that their models were robust and reliable. I think the same driver is going on in the climate change science arena. Scientists almost unanimously are now convinced that climate change is occurring and that the activities of humans are at least exacerbating it, if not causing it. There are a few vocal deniers, and I think the scientists are looking for ways to prove that their opinions are correct. And lastly, we've all seen people using complex models without understanding them. No question, models have become much more complex over the last 5 to 10 years. Stochastic models, stochastic within stochastic models, and the whole sort of machine learning area. And I believe that also is contributing to the importance of model governance. Next slide, please. So I wanted to, first of all, touch on some attributes of ISAP 1A, and after that I'll go briefly through the content. First of all, the focus. The focus is very much governance of models and not modeling. The purpose is to prevent or at least reduce inappropriate reliance on models, relying on models when either the model is not appropriate or the user doesn't understand the limitations of the model. Geography, we've already discussed why we chose to develop ISAP 1A and not revise ISAP 1. Scope is very wide. Originally it was all models. In the consultation process, we narrowed it slightly. The scope is now all models that support an entity's decision-making. So that carves out sort of one-off within the department models, simple spreadsheets and so forth. But if the model leads to an entity decision, it's within the scope of ISAP 1A. In order to ameliorate that, we also rely heavily and articulate that all the governance or the guidance in ISAP 1A is subject to the principle of proportionality. This is a concept that is developed in the EU, particularly with the development of Solvency II, and it's a very useful concept. Basically, it says that no standard should require effort that is not proportionate to the results that are, or the results or the risk of what is being done. So it basically says it makes no sense to put a huge amount of effort into determining the third decimal point. Next slide, please. I wanted to touch or to reinforce what we excluded from ISAP 1A, and essentially two broad categories. ISAP 1A does not cover how to model. It covers model governance, and we think that's appropriate. Also, like any of the ISAPs, it is not an education primer on the modeling process. The position of the AFC is that model standards should be just that, models of standards that an actuary, if they're adopted by his or her jurisdiction, is bound by, and the education belongs in separate documents, either international actuarial notes or IANs, or white papers, or other appropriate documents. Next slide, please. So ISAP 1A has fairly simple contents, the usual 3 sections like any other ISAP. General is mostly boilerplate. It does is mostly boilerplate. The scope is important, which is 1.2, and I've referred to that. All models that support an entity's decision-making. Other than that, it is mostly housekeeping. Section 2 is the meat of the standard. It lays out appropriate practices. 2.1 is an overview that applies to all of the following paragraphs. 2.2 through 2.5 cover the primary activities involving model governance. What should you do when you select a model? What should you do when you modify a model? What should you do when you build a model? And what should you do when you use a model? As you would expect, the guidance in those paragraphs is very similar, but there are subtle differences. This is why we laid them out as 4 separate paragraphs. Section 3 is communication. It's very brief. It summarizes a couple of disclosures that are unique to, peculiar to model governance. So that is ISAP 1A, and I would like to turn it over to Al. So to Al, yeah. Next slide, please, Chris.
Thank you, Godfrey. ISAP 5, as you can see, deals with insurer enterprise risk models. I'd like to spend a few minutes reminding everyone of the background of this. Enterprise risk management has been an exciting innovation, I think, in all the professional areas, particularly with regard to actuarial science. And actually, as far back as 2014, there was a decision by the IAA to, A, begin to propagate standards related to enterprise risk management, but B, to make sure that each standard was fairly specific with regard to its application. You can imagine how difficult and probably foolhardy it would be to try to develop a standard for all of enterprise risk management. So we in the task force, which we'll describe in a minute, agreed to work on this particular project, which is entitled, of course, Insurer Enterprise Risk Model. This was the title of the Statement of Intent, or the SOI, that was approved by Council in 2014. Task Force developed the exposure draft in October of 2015. That draft was circulated for comments. The final review draft was propagated August 2016, and as you can see, was adopted by Council in November of 2017. So that's a brief overview of the background. Chris, if you give me the next slide. The individuals who were involved included representation, not only a broad representation geographically, but also people with significant enterprise risk management expertise. You'll notice Arthur Els from South Africa, Gabor Hanak from Hungary, Dave Ingram from the US, who chaired this task force, Greg Martin from Australia, and Masaki Yashimura from Japan. All of these individuals contributed enormously, not only, as I said, from a standard setting perspective, but also for a very important litmus test to make sure that these were practical standards that were being propagated. If I could ask Chris this slide. Next. One of the reasons many people have asked, why should we start propagating standards? I believe there's clearly an external perspective. There's no doubt that there's growing global need for ERM guidance. Insurance Core Principles 16 and 17 that are mentioned here are classic examples of incorporating enterprise risk into the actuarial profession. I'm sure I don't have to mention to many people on this call Solvency II and all the implications thereof regarding compliance. And then finally, ORSA, which in addition to having a Solvency II application, clearly is applied all over the world. So these are external factors that are certainly driving the need for the actuarial profession to develop some type of guidance and standards to at least begin to address these very important issues. One of the key issues is that actuaries are playing important roles. As I mentioned before, those bullets up above are applicable to many professions, and frankly, many professions are stepping in, trying to address those needs. We think, quite honestly, that actuaries can play a very important role, and in many cases, the most important role in enterprise risk management. I'm sure many people on this call have been involved in a number of ways, including the bullets that you see here. From a regulatory compliance perspective, whether you actually work for an insurer, you're a consultant to an insurer, or many people are involved with the regulation itself. And then secondly, a key issue is the management decision making, one of the key values of enterprise risk management. Alluding to some of the points Godfrey made regarding 2008, I think many people recognize the term and certainly understand the concept much more now than they had before. Chris, can you go to the next slide, please? So with that as background, so that's what the IAA had chosen to do to establish a standard. We talked about the task force that was charged with putting that standard together, and finally the background with regard to regulation and decision-making processes that were needed. We decided to create an ISAP and expose it to the IAA members with the following characteristics. First of all, the focus clearly is on actuarial services involving enterprise risk models for insurance. We'll talk about some of the definitions involved with that in a few minutes, but I do want to point out this was knowingly a very specific application. The purpose, in addition to, of course, providing that guidance to the actuarial profession, is frankly to increase public confidence in the actuary's ability to perform enterprise risk activities. The scope of this has to do with the selection, modification, development, and use of enterprise risk models. Interestingly enough, as Godfrey pointed out, when this task force was first formed, we had model governance within our domain. We were actually developing a standard that included that. But when it was decided to create a 1A, which would focus on model governance in general, as Alf pointed out, we worked very closely with the 1A task force, turned over a lot of the material that we had produced so that they could look at that and see how it applied generally. So obviously, as you can see, this focused more on the selection, modification, development, and use of those models. And finally, the principle of proportionality. It's a very key issue with regard to the IAA. Standards are important. Sometimes they become difficult and sometimes expensive. And the question always comes up is it worth it? And one of the key issues that has to always be a litmus test is this principle of proportionality. Chris, next slide, please. I'd like to walk you through very briefly and give you an overview of each of the sections. However, I'm certainly not going to read you the ISAP word for word, but there are some sections that I think it would be to everybody's best interest if we spent a little bit of time highlighting. So as I mentioned before, the purpose is to provide guidance and to increase public confidence. Of course, the specific guidance is for performing services involving enterprise risk models for insurers. Interestingly enough, when we originally produced the exposure draft, we did not have a definition for enterprise risk models. And one of the pieces of information that commenters had asked for was that they felt it would be, the standard would read better and be of more help for people from a model standard adoption perspective if we in fact incorporated an enterprise risk model. So in the final review draft, we actually developed an enterprise risk model definition, and of course that was included in the glossary and was also approved by council last year. Chris, if you can move to the next slide. The definition of enterprise risk model is those models that are developed to comprehensively and consistently evaluate the risks of an entity. One of the issues, I know there are many people on this call that have experience in enterprise risk. One of the frustrations, of course, is trying to look for common language. We came across a lot of different definitions. There was some academic input. There was certainly a lot of practical input, and the task force reached agreement on this definition, which we felt truly identified the issue and yet was broad enough to accommodate all the other definitions that have appeared globally. The key purpose, again, many people are more interested in the application than they are the definition. But the applications include things like internal models, and those of you who are familiar with enterprise risk understand that. And in particular, it's specified by the IAIS. You can also have capital models. So as we go through the rest of these slides, you'll understand that what we've tried to do is contemplate models that are applied both from an external and or regulatory perspective, as well as models that are developed internally for capital adequacy analysis. Chris, next slide, please. So getting back to section 1.2 is scope. I've already talked about the idea of restricting it to selection, modification, development, and use. An important point, and one that we felt was critical if anyone is going to adopt the standard from our model, would be to incorporate the concept of stress test and scenario tests. And I'll show you on the next slide, we'll talk about those definitions. But that's a very important issue. This may be a good opportunity for me to step back and highlight the fact that many of you have worked with standards in the past, and it's sometimes frustrating when people look at standards as merely commandments or laws that must be met or complied with. We'd like to think that standards also serve a very important guidance perspective with regard to helping those who are involved in these practices so that they can develop procedures that not only make sense, but actually lead to very professional approaches. This is one of the reasons why we felt it was important to make sure that people who are considering enterprise risk modeling certainly consider stress and scenario testing. And finally, of course, the application, as I said before, assess solvency, capital adequacy, and produce risk metrics. That essentially is what we felt would be the greatest application of this standard. Chris, next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we incorporated two definitions similar to our enterprise risk model definition. I'm sure many of you know and have come across a virtual infinite number of definitions of stress tests and scenario tests. Once again, we felt it was important in developing a standard that we try to come up with some common language. As I said, and you certainly have seen, we've got people with not only broad backgrounds, but also vast geographical spreads of experience. So we recognize that very different jurisdictions have different definitions and approaches. So we felt a lot of pressure to come up with definitions that we thought could fit any of those, and we think it's passed the test, as I said before, through the exposure process and the unanimous approval at the council. We think people are universally comfortable with these definitions. No one is going to say they're perfect, but I think they serve a very good purpose. So one of the things we tried to do is establish this benchmark. I'll go over fairly quickly. Some of you may not have dealt with stress tests and scenario tests, but as you can see, you're looking at the first definition, stress test, procedure for measuring the impact of adverse changes in one or relatively few factors affecting an entity's financial position. So, for example, if you're trying to see how sensitive your company's financial position is to a 50 basis point movement in interest rates. So you could isolate the factor, run that scenario, run that stress test, and see what effect that would have, that particular factor would have on the entity's financial position. Scenario test, however, is much broader. It's a process for assessing the impact of one event or several simultaneous or sequentially occurring events. The analogy I like to use, in contrast to the stress test of the movement of an interest rate, is the recession that we experienced in 2008, the financial crisis. That had impact on any number of factors for the financial well-being of an insurance entity. Obviously, it would have a tremendous impact on the investment portfolio, but from a property casualty perspective, for example, it had significant impact on the claims arising from management liability, professional liability of accounting firms, etc. So the scenario test is meant to contemplate an event or events which could incorporate a number of factors. So those are the principal significant differences between the two. Chris, next slide. So just finishing up section 1, again, I commend you, read it. It's a fairly readable standard. We talk about our relationship to 1A and 1. We mentioned the defined terms, and of course, since it is a model standard and any region or standard setting body can adopt it, we have a recommended paragraph as far as effective dates are concerned. Next slide, please. So running quickly just through section 2, a couple of key points. First of all, understanding risk and uncertainty. I'm not going to read through each of these individually. You can read them here or certainly in the standard. But again, I just want to mention 2 key points. First of all, you'll notice the actuary should consider or may rely on others who have appropriately considered. One of the key issues with regard to enterprise risk management is the impact of working as a team. So the issue of reliance is a sensitive one. I commend you to ISAP 1. ISAP 1 addresses concept of reliance and what an actuary may or may not do with regard to relying on others. But in this particular case, we certainly recognize that in very many cases, the actuary doesn't control the environment. So the actuary themselves should investigate the situation, or certainly using their professional judgment, feel comfortable relying on someone who has, in fact, provided this type of input. So effectively, what you're looking at here is what are some of the things that should be looked at with regard to risk and uncertainty, both internal and external. So we've got financial strength, et cetera, of the insurer, as well as, for those of you who work with enterprise risk, a very important issue is risk management framework and approach, risk management appetite or attitude for the assumption of risk. These are important factors where we believe ISAP 5 serves a great role. Many actuaries who are used to perhaps more mechanical calculations need to be reminded that this requires an enormous amount of subjective analysis, including the things that we have pointed out here. Next slide, please. Godfrey's already mentioned the concept of proportionality, and in ISAP 5, we simply reaffirm ISAP 1, paragraph 152, which clearly states the proportionality issue. And in fact, we reinforce that proportionality specifically for enterprise risk when we mention respective nature, scale, and complexity of the underlying risk. Again, proportionality is an important concept, and it becomes even more important when you're dealing with so many complex risk factors that could be involved in an enterprise risk analysis, that it's important to make sure that the amount of work and the cost of the amount of work has a benefit, an appropriate benefit. Next slide, please. Getting into section 2, section 2.3, assumption setting. Once again, I want to commend the IAA. Excuse me. When we originally published the exposure draft, this read when choosing assumptions. One of the values of the due process and the feedback and comments we got from members was that it was brought to our attention that obviously in many cases, particularly under strict regulatory environment, the actuary doesn't have the ability to choose. The actuary can only advise their client or principal on certain assumptions. It's up to the client or principal to actually make that choice. So the wording here reflects that possibility when choosing or advising on the choice of assumptions. Regarding assumption setting, there are two basic approaches that are mentioned in ISAP 1, assumptions set by the actuary, and assumptions and methodology prescribed primarily by law and regulation. Again, I commend those to you. Every actuary should be aware of what the professional responsibilities are regarding assumption setting. Next slide, please. In this section, what we're talking about is what the actuary should consider when either choosing or advising on the choice of assumptions. So this is a list of representation and guidance, if you will, to the actuary, trying to help them understand some of the important factors that go into the assumption setting. What's more, I'm not going to read them term by term, but obviously there is internal and external factors that should be considered. So these are things that the actuary should consider in any type of enterprise risk modeling process. It's a good guidance, good reminder of the things that are necessary. Another interesting thing that grew out of our work is the risk management techniques. A lot of people fail to consider reinsurance and other risk management techniques, risk mitigation techniques that are applied. So we felt it was important to highlight that. Next slide, Chris. So on the prior side talked about what should be looked at. This speaks about from whom that information can be gathered. So once again, anyone who's done any work in this area recognizes management's important, other people within the insurer, business plans, other assessments of performance that have been made, as well as industry experts and other subject matter experts. Obviously, there's always the legal requirements as well. So Again, this is pure guidance, try to help the actuary perform a comprehensive and professional job. Next slide, please. 2.4 highlights 2 points that I made, stress testing and scenario testing. These are critically important. Again, one of the reasons we have them in this ISAP. Some people have often brought up other issues about why isn't there more discussion of Solvency II, or there are other techniques that can be used as far as enterprise risk management. And for that, we absolutely agree. Remember, what we're looking for is the standard where essentially, universally, when you're looking at enterprise risk modeling, you should look at stress testing and scenario testing. So in this particular case, we mentioned the disclosures, significant assumptions, including actions assumed to be taken by management. It is very important to document those, as well as any limitations of these particular tests, whether that be lack of data, whether that be management information, etc. So again, the standard requires recognizing any limitations and the potential impact on results of that limitation. Next slide, please. Another area that we spent a lot of time on, and we've gotten some very favorable feedback in the comment period, was this issue of assessing consistency among models. I guess I allude back to Godfrey's comment about people applying models without truly understanding them. Very often you can get very myopic in looking at the model you're using, or you may be commissioned to use a particular model. But it's important to understand what other models are being used within the organization. This particular section highlights that fact, that there can be many models, different stress and scenario tests, all developed by the same entity, very often, frankly, by the same individuals, but for different purposes. So the models themselves may be changed. I'm sure all of you can relate to the issues like accounting, regulation, or capital adequacy analysis. The fact that they're different, the second bullet highlights, where practical, assess the reasons for and the impacts of using multiple models and or stress tests and scenario tests. This is very important to recognize this consistency among the models. We think that this is one of the great values actuaries can bring, to make sure that you're not dealing with different models giving different results, and the company, different sections of the company going off in two totally different scenarios. And then finally, we recognize to provide an explanation of any material differences in those results. This is a very healthy process that we think will stimulate companies to be much more professional with regard to their use of models. Next slide, please. And the final section, again, I'll read it, just simply summarizes the disclosures, much of which I've already discussed here, that need to be submitted in the report. And that's our quick overview of ISAP 5. So at this point, I guess I'd like to turn it back over to Alf to handle any questions that may arise.
15 minutes. Thank you, Alan Godfrey. We have 15 minutes to go through the questions. Thanks to the attendees that are still online at the moment. We have 3 questions. I'll pick them in the order that I can read them. From Chris Townsend: do we know if any other professions have issued standards similar to ISAP 5? Al, I think that's one for you.
Yes. I guess the key word there would be professions. There are no accounting standards per se, but there are organizations. I guess we would call them subject matter experts. So there are subsets of individuals dealing in the enterprise risk space that have propagated guidance. Perhaps the biggest difference is that it is guidance as opposed to some type of regulatory or organizational compliance issues. So from a professional perspective, I guess I'm going to gravitate in this answer to another issue where a lot of people might ask the question differently. Since no one else is held to these standards, why on earth should actuaries constrain themselves by issuing standards? That's often followed by, it makes us do things in more detail, it's more expensive, our clients can't afford it, or our clients won't hire us, they'll hire another profession. if we do it. So again, the general perspective is A, no, other professions generally do not have standards per se that they must submit themselves to. It is our hope that the propagation of standards, and much more importantly, having actuaries follow those standards, and almost by definition, therefore, providing a better work product, clients will value the results. It's a delicate subject. It's one that I think everyone should be aware of, but anyone who's a believer in standards should understand that value. And it's made all the more complicated by exactly the question that individual has.
Thanks, Al. If I can then move straight on to the second question. Thanks to all the participants. By the way, you have equaled the record of this morning or earlier today. The second question from Mary Hardy reads, historically, model failures have been related to the biases of the model users. Where the model generates results that confirm the user's opinion and promise to make money for the user, it is believed, example being LTCM, where the model generates results that, it peters out here. Do you think the ISAPs address the risk of confirmation bias or other behavioral challenges? Stress tests and assessment of proportionality are particularly challenging in this context. Wow. This is probably a question for both of you, right? Godfrey and Al. I'll start with Al.
Good, and again, it's obviously, I'm sure all the listeners understand, it's a very broad question. I guess I might also argue it's an extraordinarily difficult issue from a professional perspective to put a standard together to prevent this type of bias. I think the way I look at this is, A, I think this is an absolutely valid question. It's an issue that has to be on the minds of actuaries who perform this type of work. And the way a standard, I believe, can cover this is to address the issues that we talked about in the standard, such as validating assumptions, making sure the assumptions are documented, A, B, come from people who are experts in the field, not rely solely on management. We constantly use the term actuarial judgment, and I think the actuary has to exercise types of judgment. And forgive me, but I think actuarial judgment should involve skepticism. So having the ability to challenge, ironically, one of the things that I've seen in my experience with standards is that sometimes clients can be forced to do the right thing, or rather you can challenge the way they're doing things by simply saying, look, for you to sign off, it has to meet these particular aspects of the standard. I would suggest that if someone came across this confirmation bias, it would probably be highlighted if you perform the steps that we recommend on ISAP 5.
Godfrey, probably one for you too in terms of governance.
Yeah, thank you, Alf. First of all, I'm not sure that everyone on the call recognizes LTCM. It was a hedge fund named Long-Term Capital Management that boasted about its great skill that allowed it to have extreme leverage, and it included one of Black and Scholes on its board, the Nobel laureates, among other prestigious people. Well, it didn't quite do what it said, and it was failing, and it was thought it would bring down the financial system. And so I think 15 banks and of various sorts contributed to avoid it failing, but it was a huge model failure. I think the risk of bias, and as Mary said, confirmation bias is always there. I personally think one of the strongest protections is in ISAP 1, not in either ISAP 1A or 5, which is structured so as to require the actuary to state that the assumptions are appropriate for the purpose. It won't get rid of it. It certainly wouldn't get rid of it where it's a case of fraud, but you cannot prevent fraud through standards. But I'm a firm believer that if the actuary is confronted with signing their name to a statement that I believe these assumptions are appropriate, the skepticism that Al described will kick in, and it will substantially control confirmation bias. I don't think it will get rid of it entirely. There is no single right assumption. There's some range, which may be narrow or broad, that the actuary considers appropriate, or an assumption within that range to be appropriate. So there will always be some confirmation bias. But I think the ISAPs go a long way to constraining it.
Super. Thanks, Godfrey and Al. The next question comes from Simone Davis. The question is, will the American Academy of Actuaries be adopting these standards? I will just give a summary of the answer, namely no, but pass on to Godfrey and Al sitting in the US to expound on that.
Well, maybe I think I should handle this, Godfrey.
Go ahead, Al.
Okay. The reason I jump in is, as Al knows, I was formerly chair of the Actuarial Standards Board in the U.S. So, first of all, the American Academy of Actuaries actually does not adopt standards. The ASB generates standards for practice in the United States. So any actuary practicing within the United States is subject to the ASB. So theoretically, SOA members, CAS members, and or Academy members would be subject to standards that are developed. That's the technical answer. Now, let me highlight something that's very important. What we're propagating, what we've talked about today, are model standards. The IAA is committed to providing standards that can be adopted around the world. Where there exist standards, there's no need to adopt an ISAP. In fact, 3 years ago, the very same chair of this task force for the IAA chaired a task force for the ASB in the U.S. And produced 2 ERM standards. So I guess I want to emphasize the fact that a yes or no would be a very dangerous answer here. And no meaning the American Academy has no interest in ERM. That's absolutely not true. U.S. actuaries already have standards, and I'm sure you're not surprised to hear that are 100% consistent with what we've talked about in the standards today. So there's no need to adopt an ISAP 5, quote unquote, because of those of you who are familiar with the ISAPs and ASB, this information is already covered. So forgive me if that's too big an answer, but I'm always nervous about a yes or no answer.
Thank you for qualifying my answer, Al. I can't see any further questions. We have another 4 minutes, but I don't think we need to sit it out. Yeah, Godfrey.
I saw a question from Gabor. What is the role of validation in ISAP 1A? So if I may, I'll address that briefly.
Please do. I didn't see it. Go for it, please.
Subparagraph 2.1.2 of ISAP 1A addresses validation, and I will summarize it. I won't read the whole subparagraph, but it basically says that the actuary must be satisfied that an appropriate model validation has taken place, and it defines appropriate as the model reasonably fits its intended purpose, the model meets its specifications, and the results of the model can be appropriately reproduced. Additionally, it defines validation as normally performed by individuals who did not develop the model, unless doing that runs afoul of the principle of proportionality. So it is covered by ISAP 1A and specifically by subparagraph 2.1.2. Back to you, Al.
Super, thanks. You must tell me where you saw that question, but thanks for answering that. That means we're one up on the webinar of this morning. Yeah, time is up. Can I thank all the attendees that have taken the trouble to join us? On behalf of Godfrey and Al, we thank you for attending and wish you either a good night or a good day. Thank you. We're signing off now.